Welcome to the Journey of an Aesthete podcast, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human. Theo Horesh.
It's great to be here.
It's really great to talk to you. It's been a long time. Allow me to introduce you. Normally on my show, we talk to, musicians and actors and writers and people that we associate with the arts. But with Theo Horesh, we're actually talking to someone who is a political activist and organizer. And he's also a very accomplished author. You have a book out now called The Fascism This Time.
Yes.
In the future of global democracy is the subtitle. And that's a book you should go out and get. It's very pertinent to what we're all dealing with now. Having said that, however, we have had these guests in the arts. We did do one show that would be similar to this show. I actually had George Kateb on. And we talked about political philosophy, and I really, really enjoyed that. So I guess you might say on this show, we're going to discuss, make it be partly a political show. So I think I first met you in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right?
Yeah.
When I was living there. When would that have been?
That would have been in 2014, maybe 2013.
Wow. And now you're in Leeds. So am I understand correctly that you're studying there now?
Yeah, I'm getting a PhD at the University of Leeds.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, focusing on cosmopolitan ethics.
That's fantastic. Well, I hope we can get into some of that. But normally on my show, I do what I call linear chronology, which is a fancy way of saying personal biography. And under the conceit that when you have a linear plan that's chronological, nonlinear things, the stuff people like, will happen. Things will pop up out of people's consciousnesses, and there'll be some surprises, and it won't be dry and academic.
Love it.
So, Theo, do you mind talking about your journey with not only politics, but you started off as a musician, right?
I started off as a musician when I was very young, but I put a lot into it as a guitarist. And at some point in time, late in high school, early in college, I just began waking up to so many possibilities in the world, intellectual and political and spiritual. And the music just kind of fell by the wayside. I think it was very egocentric for me. It's not for everybody, but it was for me.
It's interesting. So again, I'm somebody who is a pianist, a composer, a musician. And I was never... I think for the longest time, I always knew I wanted to do that. I think since I was a young child, maybe 4 or 5. And so maybe the age, the earliness of that, and the depth of my love of the arts made it so that it was, you could say, in quotes, inevitable. I would do that rather than something else.
Interesting. It's amazing to me how much music shapes your whole outlook on the world early on, the rhythms with which you move, the way you speak, the way you experience your emotions and express them. I think the way it shapes us is deep and complex, and at least Plato got at least that right.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm not, as you know, I'm not a. Plato's a whole other discussion. I'll go there.
I'm not a Plato fan either.
Right, but I'll go there if you want to go there. But there's one of the advantages of someone like Theo Horesh. There's nobody, of course, like you. You're totally unique. But on my show, a lot of the guests we've had have been very, I would say, learned and very comprehensive. I mean, I've had guests on my show, and they're in one particular field. And you find out that they're excellent in this field, but they actually know a little bit about other fields, and they're not as narrow as you would suspect. And that's a pleasant surprise with this podcast. I've come into this time and again, somebody will say, well, I'm a painter. They're known for being a poet. And they'll say, well, I actually was going to be a painter, and I studied with Philip Guston, and, things like that, just wild surprises. Or actors who are really great musicians, or, all the rest of it. So you're somebody who, of course, used to talk to me a lot about Lee Ritenour and Al Di Meola, and so obviously that was a big part of your life.
Yeah.
But I guess for the purposes of our show, I guess the thing we're going to discuss is politics. So how, I was a political activist for 20 years in the 80s and 90s. And I turned my back completely on it for all sorts of complex reasons. And yet you're somebody that stayed. You stayed the course. You sort of, am I right? You discovered that, and you sort of stayed with it. So talk about that.
Well, I went off and on. The earliest outbreak of it, I was meditating a lot late in high school, and I just began feeling for the world, feeling for the earth, all living beings. A lot of times I would, wake up in the morning and cry for the suffering of the world.
Wow.
And so at first my activism was incredibly spiritual.
Wow.
But activism isn't really spiritual if you want to be effective. So it might be motivated by it. It might come from a really spiritual place, but you have to think a lot. You deal with a lot of stresses, a lot of pressures, a lot of incompetence, because the vast majority of activists are volunteers, and those who aren't usually work unbelievable hours.
Mm-hmm.
And you're confronting hard truths, often things that people don't want to hear or see or think about. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to push that on people, even if you find a nice outlet like writing, where you don't have to push anything on anybody. You don't have to they all come to you. You're still a hard truth teller. So
right.
I did that through college. And I was off and on in college. I would go through bouts of doing intensive meditation and then do intensive activism in a small town in Georgia.
Wow.
Of all places. A really small college campus on the border of Alabama, which meant I was really alone. It was a really lonely place to be. And
may I interject and ask a couple of just factual questions?
Uh-huh.
You mentioned meditation. It seemed to me almost out of the blue. Did you want to talk a little bit about your spiritual practice at length, to describe to the listener what it was? And of course, now you're talking about the fruits of it. But what were you? I'm sure it continues to today. But do you mind discussing that?
Yeah, I mean, I went through all kinds of different sitting meditations. I would do hatha yoga and tai chi as well, but I eventually settled on vipassana meditation. So Southeast Asian Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism. And a lot of it's focused on mindfulness. You're just aware of what's there. And if you go really deep with that, if you're doing a couple of months of intensive meditation a year where you're spending all day, every day, sitting, just watching what arises in your body and mind, you're going to get into some really difficult material, panic, angst, terror.
Yeah.
You're going to confront emotions you didn't know you had, thoughts that most people would think were just utterly insane. Yeah. And you're also going to experience unbelievably beautiful transcendent states. And the idea in Vipassana and most Buddhist traditions is you just sit with that. You're just aware of it. You learn how to hold all of that inside yourself. So that becomes a container for holding the suffering of the world. And it becomes a container for confronting it while holding all of your other more beautiful, subtle and warm feelings as well.
That's really beautifully expressed. One of the things about you that I do admire, and I have a few theories about it that I don't know if I'll get into, is that I guess you come to this subject of politics in maybe, how do I put this, a more elevated motivation are placed in a lot of politicos.
Yeah.
In other words, so you're saying that, through your practice of Vipassana meditation in particular, that's what got you thinking about justice issues and poverty and suffering. So it happened through that route.
It's interesting. I think that I had a predisposition from early on in life to see injustices and to be very bothered by them.
Okay.
Could have been personality style.
Yeah.
Could have been that my personality style was shaped from being the youngest child.
Yeah.
I've identified.
Do you know Frank Soloway's birth order theory that laterborns are always, what is it? Laterborns first. Oh, you're the youngest child, so yeah, laterborns. Born to rebel. He says if you find a person who's a laterborn, who's not a revolutionary or liberal of some sort, or a firstborn who's not a conservative, my theory falls apart. But I guess he was being hyperbolic or joking. But yeah, I don't know. But
yeah, I think there's elements of that. I mean, of course, you can be a really responsible liberal, even a really responsible radical. Yeah. But I think there is an element of responsibility in that first child that you tend to get. And I don't know, I identified when I was a kid, and now again, having recently seen the movie The Call of the Wild, mm-hmm. I identify with Buck, this big dog that's stolen from somewhere around San Francisco. I actually think it was Silicon Valley now that he was stolen from, and taken up to Alaska during the gold rush.
Yep.
And he's giant, mm-hmm. but he doesn't know what he's doing. He's this really privileged dog, and so he kind of gets beat upon and then finds his strength. And as a little kid, I felt like that. I was a huge kid, but I was picked on. And then one day I just wrestled the bully to the ground, and he bit my arm and ran off, and everything changed. I had been building to that. I actually got inspired by Rocky.
That's a great movie. It's fun. It's really a beautiful movie. You're the second guest to talk about Rocky.
That's so funny.
One of my favorite filmmakers, really wonderful indie filmmaker, Andrew Bajowski, who sort of invented what they call mumblecore, actually changed cinema history. We spent like 20 minutes discussing Rocky in the course of our discussion. But getting back, so yeah, I want to say, if you don't mind, that a lot of this stuff is at least in part genetic. It's there from the beginning. A lot of these kind of deep spiritual, and they're actually prior to what you do in life. So I'm with you when you say you already had a sense of. So I don't want to say that meditation caused you to become an activist, or that you didn't have before that a kind of a conscientiousness or awareness. But I do think you'll agree, though, that having said all that there was something about the spiritual practice that is a beginning, right, of a certain kind of politics, right? Is that fair?
It certainly inspired me a lot. It also inspired me to leave politics a lot.
Interesting.
I had a mentor teacher late in high school that, several generations of students I've discovered called him the guru. He was, he somehow had managed to set up this gig where he was teaching philosophy classes in high school since the early 70s. And he just really set me straight on engaging in the world and approaching my spirituality in a very non-escapist kind of way. So I think that influenced me a lot. Who knows where I'd be without it. Mm-hmm. It's strange, though. I think a lot of people have a strong sense of justice that they suppress because it's very difficult confronting major social injustices.
Yeah. I mean, we're all so deeply individual and unique. In my case, I had to make a decision that for me, saving the world was not a priority at all. Yeah. After doing it, so I actually learned that that's not really me. And that's not an easy decision to make because our culture does tend to valorize and think superior of those that are, humanitarian and selfless. And so it's hard to but I had to be honest with myself and say, and this happened around 9/11, like 99, 2000, the Y2K. I said, I really turned my back on it. And to this day, the only thing I'll do is I'll vote. That's about it. That's sort of like I said to myself, that's what I'll give the political sphere. I'll give it that much. I won't be totally, a reprobate, non-civic minded person who doesn't vote, but I'm not going to do much more. And I have to say that this podcast that I'm doing is dedicated to the notion of the arts as a healing force of uniting people. I know it's not everything, and I know not everybody sees it that way, but that's kind of the project. But again, enough about that. I'm interested though, if you don't mind. You're someone that to me has a lot of emotional skills, a lot of leadership skills. You're able to organize things. And I guess, am I getting too far ahead, or does that come later?
No, that's great. It's great.
So how did that, I guess, so take me back to, you're doing the Vipassana meditation. When did you start realizing those skills or those attributes as I see them?
This is interesting to me because it ties together so many strands. I mean, my first leadership experiences came through sports, K through 12 sports. Really, I stopped that by the 10th grade. But I was always in one of those center positions, the center in basketball, the pitcher in baseball, the center halfback in soccer. Wow. And because I was a big kid, I didn't have to be that precise in my talents. All I had to do was have raw energy and strength and a feel for what was around me. And I think that gave me a sense of the feel for what was around me, and it taught me discipline. Yeah. And then later in high school, I'm leading a band, and I'm writing the music, and, and I see writing music as such a coordinating function. I mean, if you're dealing with writing the music for multiple different instruments and lyrics, you've really got to coordinate a lot of different emotional rhythms. Mm-hmm. But both of those kinds of leadership, you're also dealing with lots of personalities and abilities around you. Mm-hmm. And then as a small-time activist on college campuses, I found myself, you've got to motivate, especially on a really small campus, you've got to motivate people to get involved. You've got to inspire them. And then you've got to facilitate them in meetings, which is unbelievably difficult in more radical circles where people are opposed to hierarchy. It's not as if you can just say, okay, I'm the leader of this group and here's what we're doing, or let me take some suggestions, here's what we'll do, or even we'll vote on it. There was a sort of strong orientation around consensus.
Right.
So that taught me a lot. And then later I went on to cooperative organizing.
Hold that thought. Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you. I want to go back to the music. So, I've been a lifelong musician. So what you're saying is that, well, sports too. For those that have not seen Theo Horesh visually, he's a very, very handsome, tall, very physically fit man. And of course, I'm not surprised that you were good at sports. But getting more to the topic of music, you're saying that music made you develop certain skills that you use to this day? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Do you mind talking just a little bit more about that without getting too...
Yeah. I mean, I think that... What is... Okay, I mean, there's one thing there's just the discipline of practicing constantly. And there's the discipline of perfecting a presentation, which is going to come out in my writing. Mm-hmm. But there's so much that's tied to... You're drawing something so subtle out of yourself. I mean, how is it that you transmute an emotion into notes and chords that go together? and that you have these chords strung out in a chord progression, and every time you play a solo over it, the notes come out differently based on how you're feeling. The ability to express that stuff is, it's magical for anybody who's ever done it. And to get really good at it, so you've got your own style, and you can pretty much express whatever you want. Whatever comes into your head, you can lay out on the guitar or the piano or whatever it is you're playing. You start to have an expectation that you're going to say what you want to say. You start to have an expectation, say with my writing now, that I'm going to set the right tone for it. So I'm going to buck up against any editor that's going to break my rhythm to get the grammar right, or break my rhythm as an academic because I need to be signposting where I've come from and where I'm going. And I'm like, no, there's an emotional rhythm here that's important. That might be more important than what I have to say.
So it's a rhythm. So it's a rhythm thing. It's a thing, and again, that's part of aesthetics, right? This is a journey of aesthete podcast,
Absolutely.
And so I guess you saw early on that is this connected to the notion of one taste?
Oh, interesting. I don't think so. I don't
think so.
Okay. Maybe it's come from that. I mean, there's a sense where you break down so in Abhidharma or Abhidhamma Buddhism, is Buddhist psychology, you're going to break down the mind into multiple component parts. And so you're going to recognize that there is something happening in your material body, and that there's a sensation that happens in your body. That includes visual sensations and auditory, but they haven't even been formed into perceptions. The sense that I have a sense of objects out there in the world that I perceive. Now I form those into perceptions. There's all of that stuff could change. The material circumstances can change. The sensations can be formed together differently. The perceptions of what they mean. The things that come into my field of vision right now, there's probably 100 different things I could focus on that I'm seeing right now than the things I am focusing on. And then we have our reactions to those things. And so you start to break all of that down. The reactions in Buddhism, they'll say they're karmic reactions, but they're just reactions that you've got. When I look at a bicycle, I have all kinds of associations that come up with it. And when I look at a microphone, I have all kinds of associations, and I know to do things with it. And I go into patterns of behavior around these things. And so, to some extent, that ability to break down the world into its multiple component parts and to see your experience like that, you begin to see how you do the same thing with any of your expression. Right. And so in writing, you start to see, well, I just wrote this sentence down, and it says, Trump is a very bad man. But I could say that in so many 100 different ways to give it a different feeling. I could use different adjectives. I could make it a long sentence that rolls along beautifully and smoothly. I could make it sharp and punchy. I could put an exclamation point at the end of it. I could put lots of commas in it so it's staccato, and it breaks up, and it moves along, and it feels like you're punching your way out of it. So you start to get a feel for how you could just break the world down into any expression you'd like.
Well, I know that it's funny you mentioned your own prose. You have a definitive style, Theo Horesh style. I can recognize your writing from a sentence, and one of the hallmarks of it is the general statement, the general strong assertion, and a lot of we, sort of we, and then subject, and then verb. We do this, or they do, or and that must be, you must have developed that on purpose in terms of, I guess, trying to create your own sort of political essay writing.
Go ahead.
So it's hard. It's actually a thing in Well, it's rhetoric, but it's also my brain is freezing right now, which is unusual for me. But any of that.
I just say a little about it.
Yeah, please do.
Some of that comes from reading spiritual scriptures. Strangely,
I can see that. I can see that.
A lot of the great spiritual scriptures of the world, the Gospels or the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao Te Ching or the Dhammapada, I would read these over and over. They're short books. I mean, a lot of these will take you 2 hours, 3 hours to read. One of the Gospels might take that long, the Dhammapada or the Tao Te Ching. And so you read it 20, 30 times, and you have this feeling that there's a spaciousness to it, that it's saying something deep and profound. And there's a lot of a sense of a must that there's this, and it's to meditate on it. It's just beautiful because for me, I'm not going to evaluate those things intellectually. I have a very naturalistic view of the world. By spiritual, I just mean a sense of interconnection. I don't mean anything else going on in some other realm. But I'm going to just accept it.
I guess the word I was looking for was syntax. You're discussing the art of syntax.
Yeah, it's the word ordering. It's the way it flows along on the page. And so I always wanted that in everything else I'm reading. I mean, since it's transcendent, it stands above the world. You don't have to evaluate it, and it pauses your mental evaluation. Now, that's a little tricky if you're doing moral philosophy or you're writing about something quite deep that requires intellectual evaluation. So that style doesn't always get read in the way that it should, which is people should think critically about what I'm writing. But at the same time, I think it has a way of pulling people in and moving them on some other level. I hope.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is effective. I mean, it's certainly. And I only mention it by way of saying that it's something that you've cultivated. And saying that it is a style. There are of course many other styles, I mean, but it is very much its own style. So anyway, back to activism and that's growing the band, and I guess what years are we talking? So you're college, and then after college.
Yeah, think of the activism that's more like what you see, but what you see in the world today among social justice activists and climate activists.
Yeah.
That's going to be more college period. But most of the stuff they're doing now is more online. I don't get the sense that these people are doing a lot of meetings. But activism in the 90s, as far as I could tell, it was all about meetings. You just had to all the time. I kept recalling George Bernard Shaw's quote that I'm probably going to mangle. The problem with socialism is too many meetings. And a part of me says that that's been going on for 500 years. I just think,
Well, you know my take on that. I mean, I'm going to say something more polemical than normally I would on this show. I don't like politics very much.
Yeah.
and one of my critiques of the political altogether is because it's so interested in groups of people.
Yeah.
And I believe at the expense of the individual. And this is something, again, you've heard me go on, and I know I'm frustrating in this sense, because when I talk like this, some people think that I'm capitalist or that I'm going to go into an Ayn Rand thing. No, I just really think that there's this dignity of the individual that just gets totally left out of social scientific accounts of life, which is all groups and tribes, demographics. I mean, even now, God, that the discourse now, you can imagine how much I like what's going on. It's all anybody talks about. I actually think. Hold on. Let me continue. You can give me a rebuttal. I actually think that future historians will look on this age, and the tragedy they will note is that we were so consumed by that, almost like we missed this wisdom we were so consumed by seeing things in terms of groups and community, and that was actually our undoing. I actually think in the future they will say that about us. But anyhow, go on. I've said too much.
Do you think politics needs to be like that?
Well, let me make very clear. I think we need politics. So in other words, politics is a necessary part of life. I'm not one of these people that says we shouldn't have taxation or that we shouldn't have a government. Heaven forbid. I mean, that's no. But I do. What I do think is that secular culture has turned politics into a religion, and especially on the left, of course, and left and right both. And I think that's a mistake. So when you ask the question, does it have to be? Well, I think it might have to be, because politics is about association and it's about large groups of population, right? That's the nature of the political. It's about relation, and relation is more than one, right? So you could say that it's almost cursed by that, you know. So my initial response is yes. There's no way really around that. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I kind of start with Aristotle's humanity is a political animal. Yeah. Man is a political animal in his translated language, at least. Yeah. What does this mean? Well, we're social, and we reason together about how we make our future. Yeah. Most of our lives are mediated through institutions of some sort that have been constructed in some way. Right. We're constantly coming up against technologies that have been brought to us by businesses. We move on streets and infrastructure that was built by local governments. Mm-hmm. We are constrained by laws that were set up by state governments. And then we could say we've got moral strictures that we put upon ourselves that are tied to social institutions like the family and marriage. And so we're moving through this stuff constantly. Now, to really engage it, I mean, the first thing seems to be that, okay, we're going to have to reason a bit. That's hard to escape that. Even if you're just hardcore activists trying to push things through, usually a lot of what you're doing is you're giving reasons. You're trying to convince people. Yeah. At least to convince them to shut up, at the very least. Yeah. But usually you're trying to win people over. And if you're really smart, you're trying to win over your adversaries even, or immobilize them by having such good reasons that for them to say anything else would be embarrassing, or they'd be ashamed of themselves to argue against what you're saying. And so that means giving moral reasons, and it means thinking through sort of our duties to one another and how we all live together. Mm-hmm. So that's a very communal project. But then there's a lot of sort of protection and consideration of individuals within that protection of. You know, Theo. I mean, I do reject Aristotle's initial premise. Actually, I don't think and Marx and Rousseau. I don't think we're primarily social. I think social is derivative. I think that comes second, and that's a. I guess that's where I part company with a large tradition. Now, you see what I'm saying? So for me, social things are always already compromised to some degree. They're always going to be wanting. And that in turn means that when we engage in social projects, we shouldn't expect the moon or utopia, and we shouldn't. We should just make do and try to be the best people we can be, and soldier on. That's what I would say. But always with the reminder that this is leaving out a lot of the most important things about us, which is not social. And then interesting. It's almost like, so it's kind of a metaphysical thing of like, you're in the world and the world is compromised, right? But I certainly respect. I mean, of course, if you start from Aristotle, who am I to criticize Aristotle? Brilliant mind. Although I am, but what do you say to that? To sort of Can you see why I got out of politics? I'm consistent. Well,
you can't. Yeah.
I don't think you have to. I don't think to recognize the truths that Aristotle is expressing that I was mirroring in what I was saying. You'd have to deny what you're saying.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely a sense in which, well, we're all individuals. I mean, any given moment we can process a complex train of reasoning, arrive at a conclusion that nobody could have possibly imagined when we began, because of all the things we threw into it, which could have been really anything in the world that matters. We could have thrown into our reasoning process, and we arrive at this conclusion nobody could imagine that sets us off on an entirely new, unexpected path.
Right.
Peter Singer put it nicely. I know you don't like him, but you might like this. Reasoning is like stepping onto an escalator whose destination, we don't know where it's going to let us off. We don't know where it's going.
Yeah.
Actually, when I think about that, it's kind of absurd because you know where an escalator is going. It's like getting in a hot air balloon, and you go up and you just don't know which way the wind's going to blow you. And you're going to land somewhere entirely unexpected. Now,
I should interject. You say I don't like Peter Singer. Well, I do reject both utilitarianism and consequentialism. So that's the only thing, right? So that's separate from Peter Singer. Peter Singer's a wonderful writer. To the degree to which I could keep those two separate. Of course, some say you can't separate the two. But yeah, go ahead. So I just wanted to make that clear.
I want to just take off on that point. There's so little respect given to writers with whom we disagree these days. I think that's a really, really important point. You can recognize them as someone as a great writer,
sure,
as a great philosopher, moral philosopher, political philosopher, or thinker, that they have important truths.
Yep.
Maybe you say they're a great writer and they don't have important truths to convey, or they're a great writer and they have important truths to convey. They have important truths to convey that are part of the picture I've put together, but I reject entirely their project.
Well, in the case of Peter Singer, he forces us to ask hard questions. I mean, this is actually where I agree with him.
Absolutely.
But hard questions about, well, I don't want to get into real controversy. I tend to, I can see where I'm thinking about how much do I self-censor. I don't take a hard line he takes on some issues, but I would strongly part company with the kind of, I don't know, is it I would say it's a pro family and nothing but family culture that we're in now, where family is everything, which has connections to extreme anti-abortion, and so it's complicated. So Peter Singer, but I mean, I guess it's a long-winded way of saying, of paying respect. Say at least he's talking about issues that are very controversial, in public, and willing to write about them.
Here's the big one for people who don't know Peter Singer. Some people will say he kicked off the contemporary animal rights movement in something like 1976.
Absolutely. When
he wrote the book Animal Liberation.
I would say him and Tom Reagan, right? Would you give Tom Reagan some credit too?
Certainly as philosophers they did. Francis Moore Lepay wrote Diet for a Small Planet, which was a strong push for vegetarianism that sold like 1 million or 2 million copies in 1971. So there was something going on before that, but as a philosophical movement, he definitely kicked it into gear, and that was a major book for the longest time. So he does that, but also at the same time, he's at the forefront of kicking off the personal aid movement, the big movement where we give to all of these organizations for desperately poor people in other countries. And he does this as a philosopher, and he puts the challenge before moral philosophers. And then when it turns out that, well, aid's not really nearly as effective as we thought, he plays a major role in kicking off the effective aid movement, which measures how effective aid is in certain places and tries to get people to give to the most effective organizations. In that sense, I mean, he's a real pioneer thinker who's pushing our boundaries on our commitments to other living beings. Each of us has a circle of moral concern. Some of us are going to be concerned just with ourselves, and we might be called sociopaths. Most will be at least concerned with some close friends or family. Others will be concerned with people that they see in their lives, acquaintances. They see someone and they feel them, they're going to be concerned for them. Others will be concerned with their nation. Yeah. Others with the whole of the world. Some will go forward into all people in future generations. Right. Some will extend that to all people in future generations and domesticable animals. Some will say all life on Earth. Now the question is, where are we going to?
Theo, you used quite a strong term. You used the term sociopathic to refer to somebody whose concern is mainly themselves, right?
Not mainly, only.
Only, okay.
Only would usually get that. Mainly is quite different.
I guess it is different. So only, that's fair. Only. When I think about that as a psychiatric category or a moral category or a medical category, I think that that it has to have more than even just that to qualify. But you know, your point's taken. But I don't. You know, for me, a lot of these things, Theo, are matters of individual taste and preference. And, you know, so for me, people are that circle's going to be narrower for some than others. Now, you can make the case if somebody's circle is narrow, you can make a criticism of that person because it is narrow. Right? One could. I would never do that. But I know many do. Many philosophers do, certainly.
Now, what's interesting about moral philosophy, and I would add to it intellectual life in general in the humanities, is that through reasoning about the effects our actions have on others, by thinking through how human beings interact with one another, we begin to get a sense of the way our actions impact an ever wider circle of beings, and it becomes difficult not to feel for them in some way. And once we feel for them, it's harder not to take on commitments to them, which I think puts a lot of well-read intellectuals who don't want to take on those kinds of commitments in a very difficult bind. I mean, you don't want to burden yourself so strongly with moral commitments that life becomes a bore, and everything is worrying about what you're going to step on and use. And certainly
that would be, but see, that precisely would be my critique of that. I mean, as you know, I don't think there's something we're all supposed to do.
Yeah,
I don't. Because not only do I not think there is a thing we're all supposed to do, generally defined, but whose authority is going to, fill in the blank of what that is. So there's that problem I have with that. But you just of course just said there that if you've gone through these steps, you must, that it becomes hard to do this. And I'm not sure there's any, and I think there's many possibilities. So I'm actually not sure if you pray, if you meditate, if you read certain books, there are logical conclusions.
I don't think there are either.
There may or there may not be. I mean, I'm mindful of Susan Wolf's essay. Have you read Moral Saints? Her essay? You don't necessarily.
No.
It's an important essay.
Let me just say, I think that what's interesting here is, now we're talking about just being an expansive person, a person capable of subtle feeling, of tracing the connections between multiple different kinds of things. Mm-hmm. The question is now, how do we grapple with that in terms of our relations with others? There seems to be a few key options. One option is we become morally burdened. Now, this is the big criticism of Peter Singer, this philosopher who has pushed people to take on so many wider commitments. Another option would be we say, forget ethics. There's no way we're ever going to take care of the things we need to take care of through our personal commitments. Yeah. We need political systemic solutions. and I need to be smart about what I advocate for politically.
Right.
Now, once we go down that road, there's two paths. One is we need good technocratic solutions to deal with this stuff because it's too much for people to consider all the time.
Yeah.
There's another more activist path. So there's different versions you can take on.
Yeah.
Another one is we could wind up cutting off our feelings because we feel too much, which is always a danger. So you become the cold intellectual or the cold urban aesthete. Another is that you just simply sort of become immersed in, I've seen this in jazz musicians, that kind, gentle jazz musician who doesn't think about the world. Mm-hmm. They've got a gentle smile and warmth to them. Mm-hmm. And you see that in a lot of spiritual practitioners. So there's a lot of options.
Yeah, I mean, it's I've had to make my own decision at age 53. And, that's my decision is neither here nor there. You're the guest on the show. Your decisions are what is important.
All right. So I get to dictate that we all do activism.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't subscribe. I just can't subscribe to such a generous definition of activism. I just can't. I mean, to me, an activist is are you? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm being playful.
Oh, you're being playful. Yeah, well,
I don't even know what activism's a very funny thing, especially. Maybe this is going to send us in another direction, especially in the information age.
Yeah.
After social media, where just about everybody, through liking and sharing and posting, often on a daily basis, is involved in a little bit of political activism.
But see but I would say that they're not doing activism. I'm saying they're living in the internet age, which is this whole age with news. So, we go, you and I go around about what chicken or egg or I do think we're in a completely different age, and it's a mistake to use old categories, pre-digital analog categories to describe what people are doing. So so that's just the nature of everybody being online and doing online stuff.
But let's give a little thought to that. So in the 90s, when we were both doing activism, I would have called someone an activist who showed up to a meeting once a week that lasted an hour and a half, a Green Party meeting or some kind of environmental meeting.
Yes.
And they occasionally go to a protest once every 3 months that lasts 2 hours, and they might hand out flyers once in a while. They don't even read the news that much, but that's their big activist phase. Those were people that would be a part of the group, and they'd come in and out of the group. That kind of person didn't usually last long. Now, I would wager that the average person with a college education now who's on Twitter or Facebook does vastly more than that. And
of course they do. Sure.
As an activist.
Oh, sure. So I want to be very clear. I'm saying that so they are and they aren't. So again, the nature of the internet age is that if everything is something in this that's the thing in logic, then nobody is right. It's sort of and I think that's the internet age is it's doing that. And so I guess that's would be my. I miss those days. Those days, the 90s. I remember.
I do too.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable to me how incredibly difficult it was to muster up that kind of work.
Well, so from your perspective, we were trying to get things to happen, and so you remember the difficulties. But for me, I remember the beauty of people's faces. Like I remember I was marching against the Clinton welfare bill, which is something I felt so strongly about. I was so against that. And just the people in that march were beautiful people. I really like that's just one example, but
nice.
They were really beautiful people, and I guess the human part of politics, I guess, is what I would like about it. Even though I've been attacking the political, there is, that's human.
Where else did you see the human in politics?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't. I would say that there. So I would say basically politics. 75% sucks, and maybe the rest. The rest is okay. That's just. I'm sorry. It's just kind of. Yeah. So I don't know.
It's funny. I didn't like. There's so many kinds of work that are horrible at first that require cultivation to appreciate.
Yep.
My guess is that most types of work, the vast majority even, your first 8 hours of it is grueling.
Yeah.
Unless you've been training for a long time to do that. Yeah. I think political activism or political engagement is very similar. I used to hate writing. Just quite recently, the first book of mine that you read in 2014,
Convergence.
I hated writing that. Oh. It was so painful every time. I think the prose comes out very poetic, and I'm touching on a lot of beauty in it, but it was so hard to write. My second book was hard to write. My third one got a little bit easier. By the time I got to my fourth book, which was really my fifth, sixth, or seventh, based on various projects that didn't wind up getting put into a book, that wound up 3/4 complete or half complete. By that point, I began to love it. So that now all aspects of my writing and activism are a great joy.
That's interesting.
It's facilitating meaning. Now, what's joyful about it is it's like improvising in music. You're pulling something out of yourself that needs to be said. Yeah. It's like I have the ability to say anything I want, and I've got an audience now that I can say it to. That's so. It's not just empowering. It allows for me to unleash my highest ideals and know that without any sense of despair, like you get when you first move into politics and you feel like you can't get anything done. I'd say something similar with facilitating meetings. At first, in college, it was grueling.
Yeah, I understand a little bit of what you're talking about. You're talking about something being hard at first, and that's what piano was for me. Music was very hard at first.
Yeah.
But no matter how hard it was, I had an initial love. And I think what was always missing for me is that powerful love for the political. So that even though I went through I went through a long journey with that, of going through the pain and all that, and having some things be pleasurable. I did decide against it in the end. And maybe it's maybe it's a complex thing of how much do you love something? Do you love something just a little bit? Or, I think might be that. What do you think of that? So I would say thank God for you, because you've written this book about where we are. Do you want to talk about that now? Because
let's dive into it.
It's a provocative title, and you don't mince words, and you're. I'm kind of thankful you did this. I'm really thankful you did this. The fascism this time. Do you mind talking a little bit about where we are? I know that you're...
Yeah. So, in the broadest sense, we have been in a long phase of human history. If we start with... We could go back as far as the modern era, but more so going back to World War II, even more so going back just to 1989. Or we could say at some juncture between 1965 and 1995, when we could say the information age kicked off. We've been in a long phase of developing human capacities in at least developed countries.
Absolutely.
Mostly the developed West, but increasingly the other parts of the world as well, where we have more freedoms, more abilities to express ourselves, more things to choose from, more subtle things we're able to freely express about ourselves through the way we dress, sexual preferences, subtle ethnic differences from others around us that we can freely express without feeling ostracized, disabilities that can be shared with others without humiliation. We've been in this long phase, and in that sense, we've been moving to a more complex, integrated society, more developed society, where we're more socially free and capable of expressing more. But that's really hard to hold together.
It's hard to hold together. One immediate, I'm listening to this and I'm saying I really like it. I really loved Anthony Appiah's book Cosmopolitanism.
Yes.
And is that the name? Was that? Yeah. And I think that you, him, I think all three of us are kind of in the way on the same side. And so I guess this is a long way. I don't want to over talk, but are you saying that this nightmare is a result of those people that want to halt improvement,
yes.
or actually,
it's extremely difficult to live in very free spaces for long. Think about a time when you had a long period in your life where you didn't have any schedule. Now, of course, if you go for a very long period of time without a schedule, you learn to live with it and function well. But that's your ordinary life.
You mean like COVID-19, like the pandemic?
A lot of people had no schedule and they didn't know what to do with their time. But there's more than that. There's complexities we're confronting. There's technological complexities. There's understanding the world when there's vastly more information. There's moral burdens that have been placed on us, sometimes by others, sometimes by ourselves, simply through recognizing the interiority of a multiplicity of different beings that we weren't seeing in previous ages, like future generations and their needs that we have some debt to. So all this stuff is very difficult to confront. And now
but I want to press you on this, because have you considered that perhaps in saying it's difficult, it becomes a fulfilling prophecy? In other words, is it? So I have two questions. Is it really difficult, or because to me, what we're seeing is the expressed political will, and this is going to sound really harsh, of those people in any given society who either because they're more hateful, or just more narrow, or just in some sense are uncomfortable with this complexity, just want to destroy it. Could it be something as simple as that, rather than a developmental grand theory of history? Do you see
that's interesting.
I mean, that's my take on what's happening.
So let's start from the other point of view.
Yeah.
All of this complexity, it's beautiful. It's like going to New York City for the first time and having a good experience. It's just so big. And now, from that point of view, some people won't have that experience.
Yeah.
Either they're more introverted, they're less educated, they've been less exposed to the world, their social skills aren't as good, they're less dynamic, they move at a slower pace, they need more routine in their lives. It's going to be hard for them. But I also want to acknowledge that even for the people who have the beautiful experience, there's still a lot of difficulty. There's more to maneuver. It requires more skill. It's not like playing highly complex music isn't fun, but it's more difficult than really simple stuff for a lot of people. So you're right. There's people who are just going to say no to that for various reasons.
It's more than that. So it isn't just that they're going to say no to that. It's that they'll form a movement and an identity, campaign on the virtue of identity, and actually start to want to run things, like run governments. That's the problem. So again, we're back to my original thesis that the political itself is the problem. See, I'm
right.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying have no government, have no taxes. I'm just saying that how much of this stuff is just the inevitable disappointment of the political itself, and that the left is going to have to sort of eventually grapple with that.
Yeah, part of the problem. So there's one version of political activism where you say you've got to get involved if you're a good person, because if you're not involved, selfish people are going to be taking advantage of us all.
Interesting.
Now that's the one thing where it's a duty to be an activist, because you've got to have a certain number of people who are politically engaged for other people to prevent the greedy and ambitious from using our institutions to siphon off our wealth to the people at the top and turn us into their slaves. Now, that's one version, but another problem that you confront is a lot of people are going to have the same thoughts about getting involved, and they're going to have a completely different view than yours. Now you can say their motivations are terrible. They're being drawn into politics out of hate, out of ressentiment, the French idea of you're at the bottom of the heap and at the bottom of the social ladder, and you want to create a new order just so you'll be at the top of it. But a lot of that stuff is happening among people on the left who I would consider doing really great work. They're also motivated by these resentments that are tied to their place in the social ladder where they want to create a whole new order. So I can't say that's bad per se.
Well, no, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. I'm being a little more polemical than I normally would be on my show.
Right.
But I hope not too polemical. So I also want to clarify and make clear, I'm not against the political full stop, right? Obviously, it's part of life. But I guess what I would say is that we're seeing the emergence of a globalized problem that has its roots in flaws that are always in every politics. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think that's not? Do you think that's invalid or too abstract?
No. I think it's quite valid. I mean, I think there needs to be a bar that's crossed before people are able to express all kinds of things. So I always felt like if you're going to go countercultural, there needs to be a little bit of a bar that you're going to cross. One of the aspects of it is I think a person who's going to turn against their culture needs to be able to do it on their own to some extent. They at least need to have the strength of mind to express what they're really feeling. It gets kind of dangerous when
I have to ask you a question. Who are you talking about? Are you talking about people that are against society altogether, or who are antisocial?
I'm thinking take any number of small countercultures that we might have grown up with: punks, metalheads, hippies, or bikers, or they've all kind of gone against the culture in their own way. Now, are you expressing something? Okay, so if you're going to go against the culture, you have to at least be willing to address the things you don't like.
See, what I would say, what I'd say with all due respect to those movements, although I may not respect them as much as other people, they're falling prey to the same. In other words, they're assuming the primacy of the political. So even if somebody, right? So even whether it's a metalhead or a punk, they're giving just so much outsized importance to this thing. So even when they're against that thing, they're still being defined and governed by it. So what I would say, hold that thought. Just what I would say is that the mistake, if the degree to which, so I think our society suffers from people that are countercultural that just want to destroy.
Yes.
And our society also suffers from conformists that just want to affirm the status quo. Yes. I actually think both are a problem.
I agree. Now. But I just wanted to use the example of there's sort of a bar that I want to see people cross for their challenge to society to work out well for themselves and others. And I think it's sort of similar with politics. If you're going to throw yourself into the political arena, you should have at least done a little research into the issues you're going to talk about. I used to say, have you read a book on it? At least a book. Okay, not a book. Well, at least a few articles. If if you're going to express something in a post on Facebook, which is publishing it to everybody you know, which is quite extreme in a lot of ways. I mean, that's a really powerful thing to do.
Yeah.
You haven't even read a few articles on this issue. Have you dealt with some of the counter arguments? Are you at least willing to engage the counter arguments? are you willing to sit through a meeting to help organize one meeting to help organize a strategy of how we're going to get Biden to become a more progressive president before you're going to trash him? Would you at least hear and address?
I mean, I just want the dude to be president. I actually, frankly, don't care. I mean, again, this is my problem with progressives. I think progressives are fighting a fight from another kind of era. It's like they think it's 1992 and there's all this money and there's all this affluence and we can just sort of have socialism now. We're actually in the opposite, Bernie Sanders notwithstanding. I'm sure I'll get pushback on this. We're actually not in a moment like that, actually, unfortunately. But that's a whole. I don't want to get too. But go ahead. I'm sorry. Did I?
Yeah. I'm going to hold off on that one where we might disagree and we'd have a lot of interesting things to talk about, just so we can go deeper into what's going on with this fascism. So
it's important.
Some of these thoughts. We're in this era where people can participate in politics so easily, vastly more than they could before. They're encouraged to do so in a way that's completely haphazard, without any sort of checks on their half-conscious expressions. Meanwhile, we're living in a very wide, complex, diverse world that can be really beautiful if you know how to maneuver it, but can be really scary if you don't. And so we've got these movements of people all over the world who've not only said no to it, but they're trying to tear it down. They're wanting to attack it. They're wanting to attack it from the position of, somehow I wound up on the bottom of the social ladder and I don't want to be there, and I want to create a new order, say an order that's organized by Trump or Putin or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. I want to overturn the whole moral order. And now, what is it we're attacking? Well, since the world is complex and the world is multicultural, and the world is difficult to maneuver now, and the world is globalized, what they're attacking is the world itself.
Yeah, it's awful. That's exactly what they're doing. It's really, we agree that it's awful.
That becomes nihilistic. Now, I think nihilism is a funny thing, because there's a kind of nihilism where someone is hateful and they want to destroy things. And there's another kind of nihilism that simply everything around me is beating down on me and I don't like it and I'm going to lash out at everything. And I think you see this in punk rock scenes where you have people who are truly terrible human beings drawn to these movements, and you have other people who are angsty adolescents who grow up to be quite expansive, wonderful, functional people.
I guess we want to make clear the latter is totally different, right? You're talking about oppression. You're talking about people that just have a lot of suffering. I mean, if there's people that have enormous suffering and they want to destroy everything, well, that's one understandable response.
I mean, a lot of the punk rocker motive. I've noticed. I've never seen any studies on it, but I just noticed in my childhood that the punks usually came from wealthier families. They might have had more pressure in their families. They might have found that the facade was more bothersome. I didn't ever really know these skinheads. I mean, so you've got a whole different kind of punk there. And
I mean, my comments were not about a movement. I was just talking about suffering in general.
Yep, absolutely.
And poverty in general. I wasn't thinking. So sorry if I wasn't. I don't see things, as you know. I'm kind of a little bit dense. I don't. Again, because I habitually, systematically don't look at things in terms of group formations.
Right.
I could be kind of a bad actor. I could sort of not play along with a sense of spirit of reality. So I don't think in terms of hippies and punks. And I sort of just sometimes I'll do jujitsu and call into question those categories. Yeah. But okay, but fair. So this is what's motivated you to write this really, I think, good book, accurate book in many respects.
Thank you.
And so you're in the middle of talking about what's happening. Go ahead. It's you're calling it fascism, and you're saying
Yes. Do you want to ask why would I call it fascism, given that fascism was a very distinct 20th century phenomenon?
I wouldn't ask that question. As you know, I do think we're kind of in an internet age.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's a new epoch. So according to that, none of this stuff we're saying really is accurate, not what you would say, right? According to that theory, which I hold. It's unfair to me. Again, I'm leaving all that to the side. So I'm playing along, right, with you. I don't have a problem with it.
Great.
I don't have a problem with it. I mean, I don't, because that would be another kind of show. That would be like a show discussing the Shoah and discussing genocides and, what counts. I mean, I certainly don't agree with Noam Chomsky about the current moment. I don't.
Which aspect of what he said?
Well, the aspect, because I think it's absurd to use as an example abstract species destruction or Earth destruction and compare that to targeting 1 million people, and that's clearly, again, without going into that, I happen to disagree with that philosophically, but I guess I'm revealing more than I let on. But I would say it's very, very bad. So I'm saying what we're experiencing now is really, really bad.
Yeah.
Do you find that that's an important question that people challenge you on calling the F word, as we're going to say the F word? Or?
Yeah. People constantly challenge the category of fascism, and let's just deal with 20th century fascism was a very unusual phenomenon in the sense that you had these fascist thinkers who laid out these ideologies that were adopted by movements that were often looking into the future. They had aspects of futurism while also wanting to harken back to a more authoritarian or patriarchal past. There was a greater sense of order, a greater sense of youth to them. They were orderly, youthful movements. You were more likely to see them marching in goose step, wearing all the same clothes.
Yep.
And here we have this incredibly slovenly movement organized under an erratic leader who doesn't seem at all able to control himself or even able to convey a sense of self-control. It's not as if Hitler, the artist who woke up at noon, was so in control of himself either, who'd rage like a maniac in his speeches, but he at least was able to convey that sense of control.
Yeah.
So we've got to acknowledge these differences. But what's similar is, I think at the subtlest level, there's a kind of despotism to both kinds of fascism, where you have a leader whose purposes, for lack of a better word, are evil, who's aiming to control power for themselves, and they're willing to shape the whole society around their own needs. But what's interesting, now you have that going back as in every mode of production I could think of, you'd have that kind of despotism. But what gets interesting in the modern age in democracies is, in order to hold that kind of power, you need to pull a mass of people together for it. So fascism becomes this sort of evil despotism of modernity. And what the fascist tries to do is they try to overturn a moral order that facilitates people's cooperation, that maintains functional social and political and economic institutions, that is governed by a wide array of social norms. And they want to smash all of that in order to institute their new order. And you find that both in 20th century fascism and in 21st century fascism, as I'm defining it.
Yep.
Now, in order to do that, to hold themselves together, they create a strong in-group. They usually need a strong out-group. They also want to bully others. They feel weak inside. The order didn't work for them previously. They feel insecure inside. So they lash out at the weak and marginalized, usually minorities of some sort. All across the world, we're seeing this among what are commonly called right-wing populist groups that I would usually call fascist. So So there's these attacks on the outsiders. Now they're trying to fight this vast, overwhelming, complex, globalized reality. So how do you do it? Well, you have to shut out the world. Right. So you use endless propaganda to paint a picture of the world, and it's not going to fit the world. So you have to somehow teach people how to say that 2 and 2 makes 5. Mm-hmm. As George Orwell so poignantly expressed in 1984. How do you get them to assert with everything in them something they know isn't true? That has to be accomplished because they're denying the world and assaulting it at every turn. And these movements are always going to end in destruction if given time. In this case, we're already seeing it with the pandemic, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's probably true.
It might just as well have been a globalized war with Iran or North Korea, or a nuclear war, a full-on nuclear war. Trump was fascinated by nuclear weapons when he first came to office, constantly talked about using them, and even used a bomb in Afghanistan that was called the mother of all bombs that many people compared to a nuclear weapon.
That's so beautifully put. Just that listening to you here in this podcast episode just lay out with such clarity. I really appreciate you going into the length you did about that, because it affects all of us, certainly. It is most important. Do you mind if I mention something from the book, or if you want to read from it or talk about it when you just?
Please do mention anything.
No, because in the book you say that democracy is the most important thing. I think how you put it is that the destruction of democratic institutions is worse than anything else. You actually say it's worse than the climate change problem. Do you mind reading that passage, or at least talking about that, or
do you have it to read, or would you?
I thought you would read it, but.
I don't have it present, but I can certainly talk about it. Democracy is it's a foundational process that allows us to achieve countless other goods.
Right.
So anything that might not be achieved by the people in power because they have no interest in achieving it can be achieved through democracy. So that's going to allow us to protect minorities. If the ruling group is not comprised of women, to protect women's rights. It's going to allow us to protect workers, the environment, and it's going to allow us to take on climate change. But democracy does something else. It engages citizens in the political process. At the very least, a significant portion of the population in a functioning democracy is going to vote. And in order to vote, they're going to follow the issues. They're not going to hide from the issues because they feel they have a stake in it, in the system, to whatever extent it's democratic. They'll usually identify themselves more with the nation or whatever level of government it is through which they have democratic input, which is going to make them feel some greater debt to whatever beings are within the nation, the people in the nation, the ecosystems. So it inspires all of these things. But then on a global level, if we're ever going to have a global climate solution, we need to coordinate among governments that care, that have all these features. And the main ones that have been driving this are continually democracies that like almost all of the social goods progressives want to achieve, that social justice activists want to achieve, that feminists want to achieve, that GBLTQ activists want to achieve. Almost all of these wouldn't happen outside of a democracy. And usually in a non-democratic, under a non-democratic state, there's going to be massive dysfunctions as well, because the economic institutions almost always becomes structured so as to benefit the elites who are running the government.
Theo, can I ask you a question about democracy further? Would you say alongside Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, some of the more metaphysical or abstract theorists of democracy, that democracy is an ethical good in and of itself and transcends the political? Do you define democracy that broadly or no?
I certainly think it can be. I think we can look at it that way and experience it that way, that that democracy affirms the dignity of all people within that political system, that democracy would recognize each of our voices, that in so doing it leads to a more expansive notion of what our human groupings are and what they're capable of. In that sense, it's a good in and of itself. What I was talking about previously was all means to various ends.
Right.
I think it's important, though, that we at least be able to look at democracy through the lens of being a good in and of itself, and not just a means to other ends.
Right. Not just an instrumental means.
It's not just instrumental.
That's why when you name these social movements, I think a lot of all these social movements are themselves democracies, if I can put it that way, or expressions of democracy.
Yes.
I don't think they're just partisan. I think they're deeper. I think they're both wider and deeper than at least certainly how the right wing talks about them. And as you know, the right wing just disparages these movements as if somehow they're single issue or minority movements. No, they're expressions of our humanity. And I think so. So I guess that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier. If that resonates with you.
Absolutely. And then I would agree with Amartya Sen strongly that democracy fosters our development, fosters our capacities as human beings, and it's expressive of our development, that as we develop as human beings and as societies with more capacities, we inevitably want a say in how our lives are governed. And I think there's a certain beauty that is an end in and of itself in recognizing that we have the capacity to shape our futures with others. So if you're in a relationship, everybody listening is either likely to be either in some kind of group that does things together, or that they've been a part of a family or in a relationship. And the capacity to ask, what do we want and how can we achieve it together? It's very powerful, and it's a difficult but beautiful way to bond. And so I want to embrace democracy on that level as well. And this is why I just want to embrace someone like Biden over someone like Bernie, who I preferred and usually am far more inspired by, and just say, all right, we're just a part. I'm a moderate. I'm just a part of a political process where we're all trying to work this out together, and we've got to compromise and work with one another and reason. And sure, we're going to have to tie some things together in a sloppy way, and I'm going to wind up supporting things that I don't support deep down inside, because life is messy. And but what's beautiful here is we're all in this together. That's a very communitarian way of looking at it.
Well, I'm myself am a critic of communitarianism, but putting that aside, I like many things about Bernie Sanders. I mean, he certainly, what I could say positively about him is that he certainly has more integrity than your average politician, and that and that's probably large part of his appeal to his movement and his devotees, right? So,
absolutely.
But I want to. We're getting close, I think, unfortunately, to. I always hate saying goodbye, is what I always say. But we're close to goodbye, and I just want the audience to know about this book. The Fascism This Time and the Global Future of Democracy by Theo Horesh.
Yeah.
And get that book, and if you can. Theo, anything else you want to say? Maybe I cut you off too soon. Is there anything else you want to...
I want to ask you a question about my book, because your audience might not know. Apart from you, I'm the most broadly and deeply read person I think I might know. It's hard to judge, and I think you're the most.
Okay.
Now, that's among a lot of academics and really accomplished thinkers.
Yeah.
I may very well be wrong. Some people don't ever reference the people they read. Yeah. And it really doesn't matter that much. I started out a little slower than most people intellectually. So,
well, Theo, to be fair, if you're running a rock band and running songs and playing soccer and basketball, I mean, there's only 24 hours of the day. I mean, that's pretty... I mean, to be fair, that's quite a lot to accomplish.
I started intellectually when I was 17 or 18. And
that's.
So, are there any works you would compare my book to? What's the closest thing?
What do you mean compare? Like what works?
Anything when you read it? Were there other authors that came up? I'm interested in this both for the audience, but also for myself after this wonderful conversation.
Well, I think your book falls under the category of highly accessible public political writing.
Yeah.
So I would place it in the same category as, say, Tim Snyder's book on tyranny.
Nice.
Which is also a wonderful book. I mean, not to compare. I mean, they're both good. I don't want to rank them. But I'm saying if you're asking about that, that's the genre. I would place it, I guess, in that genre, if that's a genre. Was that what you intended?
It's exactly what I was asking, and it's exactly the book I thought was most like it, and I would compare them. Yeah. And I think that my book is not as good as his.
Really?
And other people should read his first.
Well, I don't know. I mean, what I would say is that you do things that he actually doesn't do. In fairness to you,
it's true.
I mean, his book, your book is comprehensive in a different way. What I think the difference is your activism. See, I guess that gets back to the beginning of our conversation on this podcast episode. I really think that all those years of organizing and learning how to communicate with people, what I would call the emotional intelligence, I think you have that in spades, and I think that shows up in the writing. And,
nice.
and I would say that actually is it advantageous to your text, to your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if you see what I'm saying, but
I absolutely see it, and I feel it. And I actually, for all the negative things I can say about social media, constant dialogue and debate on these issues over 4 years' time on Facebook really honed my arguments.
You mean like flexing a muscle?
It forced me to get to the point.
Flexing a muscle, that I guess you're saying. You're kind of flexing muscles. Strengthening
them through that. And it just forced me to get to the point. And people on Facebook do not tolerate extraneous arguments, intellectual play, thinking for its own sake. And I really don't like that. But if I want to write a meaningful book that's going to have a strong effect, it puts me in a better position than anyone. I mean, I'm just engaging with so many different types of people that are engaged politically, often through debate, often through dialogue, often about what we should do as activists at this moment. How should we debate these people? Well, I'm debating them. I'm moving from writing my piece to going over and debating people who are not on a high level, that are trolls. They're trying to rile me up. So what's going on with them?
Theo, before I say goodbye, is there anything else additionally you want to say either about your book, where people can get it, how people should get it, or anything else? Or
No, the book's available on Amazon.com. Theo Horesh, The Fascism This Time and the Global Future of Democracy. It's only one of 2 books that I'm aware of that really lay out fascism as we're experiencing it in a highly coherent way that gets into some of the philosophy but is accessible. The other would be Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works. There's, of course, others that are going to use it, but in a kind of comprehensive way. It's worth checking out the beginning of it on Amazon. This was a wonderful conversation. I love the way we wove together so many strands of thinking and feeling and expression and got to the heart of the book towards the end. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm always love having people come on my show, able to express who they are and express themselves, and have it be about them and their viewpoint. So thank you for doing that on this episode, and thank you for both for your friendship, long-standing friendship, as well as writing this book, and a really wonderful discussion, Theo. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Have a good week. Goodbye. Thanks.